Quick question about the homework. We're supposed to be able to connect to the Flask and Node.js parts of it individually, right?
Yeah, they actually don't have to talk to each other. Your browser talks to both.
Okay, because I can get a 200 response from one of them, but I can't connect to the other. I was doing this with curl.
You have a port defined for each?
Yeah. The Flask app has a port defined inside of it. I'm not sure about the Node.
Oh, yeah. You might have to tell Node which port you want it to listen on, or otherwise just know what port it's going to use. So let's see how we do that.
Is that not in the code for it? So basically, in the CMD part of the doc file, just have like include a -p whatever port that I want to use.
Probably. Let's check. I think you can do an environment variable called port. And so in the Docker file, you can put env port equal 8080 or 5000 or whatever you want.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what you want.
I do have expose in the Docker file, but that wouldn't.
Yeah, but that doesn't tell Node what to do.
So env.
Of course, this has to be before command.
Yeah. So obviously all caps env, all caps port equals, or it's port colon.
Equals.
Okay. And I don't need quotes or anything around the number.
Mm-mm.
Let me go ahead and rebuild.
Okay, so while you're checking that, so it's come to my attention we don't have class Friday, and therefore the homework related to Kubernetes will have ready for next week, or at the time of next week. Today, I just want to show you, I'll answer questions about the homework due tonight, but also show you how to do the cluster on Amazon, just those steps, show you it working for your knowledge. But the assignment will just be, you could just use Delin when we get to that. And that will be it. So it could be shorter, but I don't want to introduce more than that and have something like partially finished. So are there other questions on the assignment?
To anyone that's done it, how many hours does it take?
I know some have done it.
Do you know what you're doing?
The last two classes, so we'll see.
Some have completed it.
It's not super complicated if you know what you're doing. I've just been running into some weird stuff that I've had to spend a lot of time going through the videos to realize what I did wrong.
Yeah. So Matt knows what he's doing, but
there was also a period of time for a couple of hours where I forgot that I had to rebuild whenever I made changes.
yeah. So for those who have done it, short or long time, what do you wish you had known?
The class we had Monday was really helpful.
Okay.
All right, so I'll watch that video.
If you can only watch one. Anything else, like You know, I understand that I'm kind of, this is probably harder than it needs to be because I don't have like a book. I'm sure there are books. I don't know. I've not seen it. I've not looked for any books on Docker, but I'm sure they're out there. So I don't know what a good one would be. But what I like to show you is the official documentation, because that will always be there and be up to date, whereas books and blogs go out of date pretty quickly. So it's good to know how to get to things that are official. But is there anything else, like advice like this? Like, I know there are reference files for Docker Compose and Docker that show you what all the things mean. So that's one thing.
Yeah,
That might be
I've been
advice.
trying to find those, and I haven't found
Well, let me show you where that is.
what I've been expecting to find anyway. Like there's the site that we've been looking at, but that doesn't go through like all the options for that you can include in like build. Where like
Yeah,
I found I had to like look up each thing individually and hope I got the wording of it right for what I was looking for.
Carrie's got a link.
I added a link in the chat that Professor Plonk told me about. Well, he told 3 of us about.
Yeah.
And I started watching and going through it, and she basically goes over everything. It's pretty helpful.
I love the kind of like table of contents in the video at the bottom. That's a new feature.
Yeah.
So let's check on this. If I share.
Yeah, it's a 3-hour video, and I haven't started watching it, but apparently it's really good.
What is container?
There are some parts you can skip because she like talks about how to install it in different types of machines. So there's literally some parts you can skip over.
It's really nice that the videos these days are starting to get segmented. I think that's what Dr. Eckroth was just mentioning.
Yeah, this is the first time I've seen that. It's pretty cool.
I've seen it in a few places, but it'd be really nice if more and more people kept doing that.
Yeah, it seems to have everything you need here. Cool.
And did it mention the compose stuff?
Yeah, it's here, hour and a half.
Mm-hmm.
So this is if you're not using Compose, and then if you switch to right, the equivalent. Mongo example. Okay. Any other questions?
Just a general comment, I guess. For the most part, the only new stuff I would say, as far as this assignment goes, is probably Docker. At least from my perspective, was Docker and Docker Compose. Since we've already been using the same app and building it and running it, for the most part, it's basically taking those same steps and putting them into a Docker file.
Yeah, that's the intention, because it's only like a week assignment, so you can only do so much. But that's why I was curious about advice, if people can describe what they're experiencing.
And I guess just as far as the Docker file goes, I don't think you had mentioned it before, but basically the order, even though these Docker files are going to be pretty small, and it might not matter as much for this class, but definitely once you start getting a lot more steps in your Docker file, the order helps quite a bit, because the first time you run it, obviously, and build your image, it has to run everything in the Docker file. But after that first time, it's only going to run the steps that are involved in whatever changes you make. So if you're copying a Python app, and you build your image, it'll run that step to copy it into the image. And then the next time, if you make a change to the Python code and then rebuild your image, it's going to have to copy that again. So if you move everything else that was static, like setting up the server or setting up Node, earlier in the file, then it'll never have to run that again. It'll only have to run the steps that copy the code over to the image.
So like a package installation, do it earlier.
Right.
Okay, cool. So Carrie, for grading, I'm usually lenient, a couple hours, but if it's due midnight, it should not be the morning of the next day, if that makes sense.
For everybody that runs into the question that I asked earlier, it did work. The including the port as an environment for the Node.js.
All right, so let me show you what's involved for EKS. So the issue I had before was I was running the command line interface for AWS through my root account, and that was simple, but it was then too difficult to associate the cluster. At least I couldn't figure out a technique with the role-based access controls and stuff to associate my root account with the cluster. So the preferred approach is to actually make an account with that particular kind of purpose to manage, certain services in AWS, not all services. So I made an account for specifically cluster work. And what that needed was it EKS control, were certain permissions, and those are documented in the documentation for the tool that creates the cluster. So this is like the AWS CLI tool in that it uses the same credential file, but everything works out a lot easier if you actually set up the credentials for that specific user with the right permissions before you bother creating the cluster. And then if you do that, it'll create the cluster with the right permissions, with the right user and roles, so that that user that you created the cluster as can actually see the cluster. Also in the web interface, it can see the cluster. So those permissions, I found them in the GitHub repository. I think they're actually a web page somewhere along this table of contents somewhere. I guess. This one should have been in the IAM category. Minimum IAM policies. So this is what the user needs associated with it. I don't have permission to list users, so I don't get to see them in this account, but made or used, if they're already there, these policies for the new user. So this gives EC2 access because in this particular case, I'm going to create EC2 worker nodes instead of Fargate. And so it needs to be able to create those kind of things, basically allow everything for EC2. Also, CloudFormation is the kind of template language for creating a bunch of stuff simultaneously, like the EC2 and the networking that connects them and so forth. So the user needs access to CloudFormation. And then EKS, which is the cluster environment, the Kubernetes environment, and basically needs everything there. And then some limited IAM things in order to associate the right roles for that cluster, the right policies for that cluster. So establish that for this cluster admin user, and then put those credentials in the .aws credentials file on Delenn, and then ran this command to create the cluster. So that command says create cluster with this name. I want to have SSH access, so it should set up the key from my home directory on Delenn. It should put that public key on the nodes in the cluster so I can access them directly in this region. And you have to give the zones that you want. I had to avoid zone D, where the public subnet is, or 1D, I mean, because it said it was full. So provided 2 zones for redundancy replication. And then it went off and did its thing for a bit. It sets up the networking. And so when you use Fargate, you have to set all these things up yourself. And that's what I didn't do correctly. So if you let it just, if you don't say Fargate, it'll use EC2 and it'll set it up for you. And it does not automatically turn on logging. You can run a separate command here to get log information from your cluster, like which types of logs, or you can just say all logs. And sets up the API endpoint for the control plane. And so there's the control plane being set up. CloudFormation stack. It's like a Kubernetes stack in this, or template in the sense of it says what to apply, set up all these things, have them all talk to each other. And so it has to wait for that to start up. It decides, because I didn't tell it, how many nodes I want. So it made 2. And actually at this point you see it's moving the key from my Delenn account over to the machines. Starts it with Amazon Linux on the EC2 nodes, and sets up the role so the user I'm running it as can look at the cluster. Yep, and it says it puts the login information in the kube config file in my home folder. So then kube control will be talking to the Amazon cluster. So if you were to do something like get nodes, these are the 2 EC2 nodes it made. You can also do wide format, gives you more info. So these are their external IPs, and it already has my public key, so I don't need to say anything special. I just have to know that it's EC2 user login at this worker node. So you'll see that kubelet and such things are running. Kubelet, container D to manage the containers, Docker D, and so forth. So here's our worker node that it made for me. Wouldn't normally log in really to do anything, but it is there. Back on this side, if you go to EKS, clusters, there it is. To nodes. basic stats. And I don't have any specific workloads. These are just default ones. It's not really doing anything yet. I'll put a deployment up in a second. And you can see the public IP. So let's go to the VPC. And you'll see it's not, there's no front end, there's no access point yet to the outside world. You can SSH to the worker nodes or whatever, but there's no like main entry point for the cluster, because you gotta have it, you gotta deploy something and set that up. So we'll do that in a second. I don't have any add-ons or anything. I do want to show you how, I guess on Monday, if I get around to it, other things that you can add on Kubernetes that other people are making, like a package, like a repository of applications. So you're not always having to make your own deployments for everything. So that's what you get here. Now, what we want to do next is let's create a namespace, because everything else will depend on this namespace existing. So again, the namespace just gathers deployments under a common name. It's just grouping things. So nothing's actually running. It's just like a tag. And you can see everything in this namespace. Which is nothing, because I just made the namespace. So now let's take their example deployment, study it for a second. So this is a Amazon documentation example. Scrolling past the service first, we have a deployment. So remember that the -- means you can put multiple like documents, you would call them, in YAML format. You can put them in the same file, or you can make separate files if you want. So this says I'm defining a deployment. It's in the my namespace, and I'm going to call it my deployment. And it's going to use the label app, my app. You can make up anything you want for these two things. So other things will mention like, hey, I'm referring to the label app, my app, which will refer to this deployment. The spec for the deployment, I want 3 of the following. Well, specifically 3 of whatever this mentions, which is going to be, again, referred here. So make 3 copies of this thing, which is this thing, because its label is the same. The template for what I want to replicate is the following spec. And basically, besides the affinity stuff, which is not important to us, the container I want to replicate is this basic Nginx, which is a web server. It's just a front page that says, hey, I'm a web server, I'm working. That's all it's going to do. And the web server will be running on port 80, so this indicates that. So to reiterate about what Kubernetes is up to, you now know about Docker. Docker takes an image, which is a predefined thing that you've built ahead of time. It's got certain code in it, and it knows how to start. When you say, I want to run that image, Docker is going to make a copy of it as a container, or multiple copies if you want multiple such equal containers, and start them all up. And Docker Compose is a limited way to do that multiple times and do your ports and your volumes. So what Kubernetes adds to that picture is a way of launching lots of these and also keeping them running or updating. If you say, okay, now I want more, it'll add more or fewer, or if you want to have them be load balanced or whatever, so that when one is busy, all the data goes to the second one and so forth. So Kubernetes is going to launch containers just like Docker would. So you do mention containers here, just like you would in a Docker Compose file. You say, I want to launch this thing that's been pre-built, this image that's been pre-built. I want to launch it as a container. And you can refer to an image you put on Amazon or that you put on Docker Hub, or you've just got on your machine because you've built it. And so again, what Docker's adding is this thing like replicas and a bunch of other stuff that we'll get to some of that stuff that says which containers to start and what should happen with them if they disappear, like because it crashed or whatever. So that's the deployment. It'll launch 3 copies of this Nginx web server. Each copy is running in its own container on port 80. Now, when the container is started, of course, for the, I guess the control plane, like it's got to be able to get to the different versions of this Nginx, this different copies of it, even though they're all on port 80. It's got to know which ports actually go to the different containers, which could be on different nodes. So that's where the service comes in. It says, I want the port 80 in each of these containers to be exposed as some port so I can talk to that web server. I can get into the container. And the original, I want to change this back. Let me see what it was. I want to make that change in a second. I just didn't specify. So we'll see what it makes. So the service concept is to basically expose the ports so that you can talk to the so-called cluster as a whole, and it's actually directing data to the containers. So if you say, I want to talk to the cluster on port 80, your commands will go to port 80 inside the containers. And again, which containers are you talking about? That's the selector. It's going to refer to the labels. So they should match. Okay, so I'd say unless you're using a volume, I guess, you're often going to have a service with your deployments so that you can actually get to things. And in Kubernetes, the way you launch stuff, you don't say run or anything like that. You say this template, which I just showed you, the file, I want that to exist. And so you apply it. And then it does whatever it's got to do. If they already exist, it's fine. It just says, well, I don't need to do anything. If they don't exist, there's only 2, and you said I want 3, it'll make another one, and so on. So it does whatever the difference is between what it has in the cluster already and what this file says needs to be the case. Just do that. And it quickly responds because in the background, it's actually starting these things up. You can do the everything in that namespace, which was nothing, and now it will be something. 3 pods. By the way, it calls the it launches, it puts containers in a pod. So remember our glossary we did like a week back. The pod is the thing running on the machine. The pod has the container inside of it. It could have multiple containers, which is why they have a pod, because you could have like containers along with the main, like you have your web server and you have another container that does monitoring or something, a sidecar container, they call it. So it is launching containers, but it's making a pod to group the container. I keep hearing Discord action. I don't know what it is.
Maddie.
Suddenly like a bunch of, what am I thinking? Like messages, that's the word. Bunch of messages all at once. So 3 pods, because I said replicate 3 copies of this server, and then the service, which connects them through that port. And notice there's no external port. It's still not available to the world. it made a cluster IP type of service. And we want something that the whole world can access, or maybe just myself, but I want to have a public IP. And I have to change the type of the service from cluster to load balancer. So I'll do that in a second. Also, it makes a deployment. So the deployment is that file I just showed you, which says I want 3 of these things. So that's the deployment represents the whole group. And the replica set is the fact that I wanted 3. It's keeping track of, are there actually 3 at all times? So there's a lot of things that got created by applying that file. And you can look further at any of these things. You can say in the namespace, describe the service, my service. Oops. Get more details. So those are the nodes and the actual ports that it represents. So when you go to the service through port 80, and I'm going to make it public in a second, it can go to any of these things that are actually waiting for, you know, someone to talk to them. Now, if you actually had an important job running, like you're transforming videos or something, a lot of these endpoints will be busy. So you're going to want a load balancer, and load balancer is how you get the public IP also, which will say when the request comes in on port 80, which machine do I choose to send it to? And that will be decided based on the load of the machine. So to make that change, this is basically how most changes get made in Kubernetes. You do an update to the file that you use to create it. So we'll modify the spec to be a load balancer type instead of a cluster IP. Make sure I typed that right. Balancer. So cluster IP just exposes on an internal IP, and you can only do it from within the cluster. If you don't say anything, that's what you get. So we want an external. So that one changed, then you apply again. See how it said the deployment didn't change, but the service did. And then we look again at the service. And it's starting up, I guess. It's changed to a load balancer. And this is the external way to access it. So, and it's on port 80, so our browser will handle that. If we go to the browser and dump that in there, port 80, I guess. It's not there yet, but it is starting. Let's see. We have our deployment workload. Those are 3 pods, each having the 1 container. That's a replica set, those 3 things. It's progressing, okay. And then don't want that. I don't remember if the service shows up here. So now we're good. So we just have to wait for a load balancer. But here's our website at this address, which is going through the load balancing service into one of those pods, into the container, finally talking to actual Nginx program. The other thing I want to show is there is a Kubernetes dashboard that we can put on our cluster. Run apply against the deployment definition on the internet somewhere. This is where it is. Actually, let's look at that. Makes a namespace, makes a service so that you can access this new dashboard under 443 and it will go into 8443 in the pods. It does some secrets to make the token so you can authenticate yourself. And here's the deployment. One replica of the dashboard using this image. It will listen on port 8443. It just mounts stuff to get the various certificates to do the secure HTTPS. There's a second thing for metrics that will listen on port 8000 and talk to this deployment. It has one replica of a service that runs on port 8000. That's it. So when we apply this, makes all the things defined in the file and see there's more things now. Oh, actually that's my namespace. I meant to do, what was it, Kubernetes dashboard? Yeah, namespace, Kubernetes. This is why you have namespaces, right? I don't want all that stuff appearing in my personal kind of deployment. All those things are out there. And if we do kubectl proxy, it's kind of an easy way to get access to the cluster without making a public IP. So it'll listen on the LAN, which means I got to tunnel it because I'm not physically typing at the LAN. So I got to make sure that's being tunneled. At 8001. Okay, so yeah, 8001. Might not have started up yet. What else do I need? It's worked before. I might have, it might not have tunneled. I might have too many things open. Let's reconnect. It's being forwarded. Okay. I must have like gotten on Delin multiple times, and that particular session I was typing in wasn't forwarding because a different one had forwarded beforehand and they conflicted. So if you just access the front, you're just getting the Kubernetes API. If you go to address, which is in the documentation for the dashboard. And I need to get a token from